Pull up a satellite image of the American West and look at the empty middle of it, the wide gray-brown gap between the Rockies and the Sierra Nevada that most maps just leave blank. Now, drive through that gap on the ground, on Interstate 80, and look up at the mountains on either side of the highway. Halfway up almost every one of them, there's a line. It runs dead level, mountain to mountain, for hundreds of miles, cutting across 5 states like someone took a ruler to the rock. It was not put there by wind. It was not put there by erosion working over millions of years. It was put there by a shoreline, and the sea that carved it was still there when human beings were already standing on its banks. That sea is gone now, but almost everything strange about this part of the country, the salt flats, the ghost towns, the fastest cars ever built, the rarest fish on the planet, and some of the most secretive federal land in America, all of it sits inside the footprint of that vanished water. Nobody tells you that these things are connected, because almost nobody has ever laid the whole map out end to end. We're going to do that today. 18 facts about the Great Basin, moving from the strange to the classified, each one another piece of the same buried shoreline. By the end, you'll understand why a mountain range in Oregon, a mine in northern Nevada, and one of the most guarded runways in the United States are all, geologically speaking, the same story. The man who named this region never understood what he was naming. In the winter of 1843 and into 1844, the explorer and Army officer John C. Fremont led a survey expedition through the vast dry interior between the Rockies and the Sierra Nevada, and he was the first person to notice something that should have seemed obvious. None of the rivers in this territory reached an ocean. Every stream he crossed either sank into sand, pooled into a salt marsh, or simply stopped. He coined the term Great Basin to describe it, a name that has stuck for more than 180 years. But Fremont had no idea why the region behaved this way. He assumed it was simply arid land with unlucky drainage. He had no concept that he was riding across the drained floor of an inland sea, because the science to prove that didn't exist yet. The man who named the Great Basin died without ever knowing what it actually was. This is the largest region in America where water is not allowed to leave. The Great Basin covers somewhere close to 200,000 square miles across Nevada, western Utah, southeastern Oregon, southeastern Idaho, and eastern California. For scale, that is an area large enough to swallow the United Kingdom twice over, with room left standing. And within that entire footprint, not one single drop of water that falls as rain or snow ever reaches the Pacific or the Atlantic or the Gulf. Every river here is hydrologically trapped. It either evaporates in the open air, sinks into porous ground, or pools into a shrinking salt lake with no outlet. Geologists call this an endorheic basin, a closed system, and this one is the largest of its kind in North America. Water comes in. Water never leaves. It has been that way for longer than any human record exists to describe it. The lines on the mountains are a measuring instrument nobody built on purpose. Go back to that shelf carved into the rock above the highway. Geologists call these features shoreline terraces, and they are not decoration. They are wave-cut benches, physically identical to the flat-marked tide leaves on a rock at the beach, except carved by a body of water that stood in one place long enough to cut stone. In 1890, a United States Geological Survey scientist named Grove Carl Gilbert published a 438-page government monograph mapping these terraces across the mountains above what is now Salt Lake City. He identified at least 3 distinct levels, each one marking a different depth the ancient lake held for centuries at a time before dropping again. Gilbert proved, with government-funded fieldwork and hard geologic evidence, that an entire inland sea had lived and died in this exact spot. The lines are still there today. You can see them from the interstate. A dead lake bed in western Utah has been breaking land speed records since before the First World War. The Bonneville Salt Flats sit in the driest, flattest remnant of that same ancient lake, a crust of salt left behind as the water receded, polished by seasonal flooding into one of the most perfectly level natural surfaces on the planet. Since 1914, racers have used this dead lake bed to attempt land speed records, and Bonneville Speedway has hosted hundreds of runs across more than a century, including some of the fastest wheel-driven vehicles ever built. But the flats are not permanent. Potash mining operations pump brine out from beneath the salt crust to extract minerals, and independent surveys have measured the salt layer thinning by a significant margin over the past several decades. The same Dead Sea floor that made land speed history possible is now measurably disappearing, mined out from underneath the very records it made possible. The lake did not fade away quietly. It broke. Roughly 14,500 years ago, at its largest extent, Lake Bonneville held enough water to rival Lake Michigan in size and depth. Then, at a natural sill near Red Rock Pass in what is now southern Idaho, the rising water finally overtopped a ridge of soft sediment, and the barrier gave way catastrophically. In what geologists now call the Bonneville Flood, an estimated volume of water in the thousands of cubic kilometers surged north through the Snake River drainage in a matter of weeks, one of the largest documented floods in the geologic history of the planet. The lake's surface dropped by roughly 350 feet in a single catastrophic event. Massive boulders, some the size of houses, were carried and deposited far downstream, and you can still find them stacked in improbable places along the flood's path today. Physical evidence of a sea that did not evaporate peacefully, but tore itself open. The crews who trained to end the Second World War in the Pacific rehearsed on this same Dead Sea floor. On the Utah-Nevada border, at the eastern edge of the Bonneville Lake bed, sits Wendover Army Airfield, a remote desert installation established in 1940. At its wartime peak, this outpost in the middle of nowhere housed more than 17,000 personnel, and it became one of the most secure installations in the United States Army specifically because of where it sat. The emptiness of the ancient lake bed made unauthorized approach nearly impossible to hide, and for months, flight crews practiced dropping precisely weighted dummy bomb casings across the open salt in near total secrecy. Most of them never told the actual purpose of the exercise until after the missions were flown. The isolation that made this training possible wasn't an accident of geography. It was the direct legacy of a lake that used to be there and left nothing behind but flat, empty, defensible ground. For 80 years, nobody could explain rocks that move by themselves across a dry lake floor. On the western edge of the basin, inside Death Valley National Park, sits Racetrack Playa, a perfectly flat, dry lake bed where stones weighing up to several hundred pounds leave long, curving trails across the surface, evidence that they slide across the ground entirely on their own. For decades, this was treated as an open mystery, with theories ranging from unusual wind patterns to magnetic anomalies. In December 2013, researchers finally installed time-lapse cameras and GPS-tagged stones and caught the actual mechanism on film. In rare winters, when the playa floods briefly and freezes overnight, thin sheets of ice only a few millimeters thick break apart in the morning sun, and light desert wind pushes those floating ice panels directly into the stones, driving them slowly across the soft, wet mud below. 80 years of theories, and the answer was ice and wind acting on the floor of a dead lake. The rarest vertebrate on the planet survives in a single flooded cavern connected to this same ancient water system. In a remote corner of the basin near Death Valley, a limestone cavern known as Devil's Hole holds a single pool of warm water, barely the size of a modest swimming pool, and inside that pool lives a fish found nowhere else on Earth called the Devil's Hole pupfish. The entire wild population has at various points numbered only in the low dozens, making it one of the most critically endangered vertebrate species ever documented. The pool itself is fed by a deep desert aquifer, part of the same underground water system tied historically to the region's ancient closed basin lakes. An entire species, one that has existed in the total isolation for thousands of years, survives today only because a single pocket of that vanished water system never fully dried out. A mountain in Oregon rises like a wall and then disappears just as fast on the other side. Steens Mountain, in the far southeastern corner of Oregon, is not a range. It's a single massive block of basalt, roughly 40 miles long, tilted gently upward across a long western slope before ending abruptly in a sheer drop of more than 5,000 vertical feet on its eastern face. That is close to 3 Empire State Buildings stacked directly on top of one another. At the base of that cliff lies the Alvord Desert, a dry lake bed that itself is the remnant of a Pleistocene-era lake, and hot springs bubble directly up out of the fault line at the mountain's base. If you've made it this far, you already know these details do not stay separate for long, so if there's a fact from this list you want to sit with for a minute, drop it in the comments because the ones people bring up down there are usually better than the ones I plan to include. If you're still with me, the deeper material starts now. One of the oldest lakes in North America is being kept alive by a court order. Mono Lake, on the eastern edge of the Sierra Nevada in California, is estimated to be more than 760,000 years old, making it one of the oldest lakes on the continent. Beneath its surface, freshwater springs deposited calcium carbonate for thousands of years, slowly building strange limestone spires called tufa towers, entirely underwater. Those towers are visible above the surface today only because, starting in 1941, the city of Los Angeles began diverting the lake's tributary streams through an aqueduct system to supply its growing population. Over the following decades, the lake dropped by more than 40 vertical feet and lost close to a third of its surface area before legal intervention in the 1990s forced minimum water levels to be restored. A lake older than the last several ice ages nearly disappeared into a city's plumbing within a single human lifetime. A boomtown of 10,000 people vanished, and nobody ever cleaned it up. Bodie, California, sits inside the same broader watershed as Mono Lake, and at its peak around 1879, it was home to roughly 10,000 residents, dozens of saloons, and active gold mining operations running around the clock. By the middle of the 20th century, the mines had closed and the population had dropped to zero. Today, California State Parks maintains the site under a policy known as arrested decay, meaning nothing is restored and nothing is removed. Furniture still sits inside abandoned homes. Store shelves still hold merchandise from the last day anyone worked there. It is one of the most completely preserved ghost towns in the American West, sitting quietly at the edge of a lake basin that is itself a fraction of what it used to be. The largest lake in the American West outside the Great Lakes has lost roughly half its water in under 2 centuries. The Great Salt Lake in northern Utah is the last major surviving remnant of ancient Lake Bonneville, and since the arrival of large-scale settlement in the region in the mid-1800s, it has lost close to half of its total historic volume to agricultural and urban water diversion. In the summer of 2022, the lake reached its lowest recorded level in documented history. As the lakebed is exposed, it releases fine dust laced with naturally occurring arsenic and other heavy metals, and that dust is now measurably drifting across populated areas of northern Utah during storm events. At the same time, the lake's extreme salinity supports one of the largest commercial brine shrimp harvests on Earth, supplying a significant share of the feed used globally in farmed seafood aquaculture. A single desert lake that survived roughly 14,000 years since the end of the Ice Age may not survive the growth of the cities built around it. A famous work of American art has become an accidental instrument for measuring the death of a lake. In April 1970, artist Robert Smithson arranged more than 6,000 tons of black basalt rock into a 1,500-foot counterclockwise spiral, extending into a remote arm of the Great Salt Lake, a piece he titled Spiral Jetty. Within 2 years, rising lake levels submerged the entire structure, and it remained underwater for roughly 3 decades. Smithson died in 1973 and never saw the piece resurface. By the early 2000s, decades of water diversion had lowered the lake enough to expose the spiral again, and it has remained visible ever since. What was built as a permanent artwork has become, almost by accident, a physical gauge tracking exactly how much of an ancient inland sea humans have managed to drink away in half a century. The most famous disaster in American pioneer history did not begin in the mountains most people picture. Most retellings of the Donner Party focus on the winter of 1846 and 1847, high in the Sierra Nevada, where the group became snowbound and resorted to unthinkable measures to survive. But the disaster actually began weeks earlier, on the dry floor of the old Bonneville lakebed. Following bad advice from a guide who claimed a shortcut called the Hastings Cutoff would take 2 days to cross, the party instead spent nearly a week fighting through roughly 70 miles of the Great Salt Lake Desert, losing wagons and draft animals in the process. That delay pushed them past the safe seasonal window for crossing the Sierra Nevada, sealing their fate before they ever reached the mountains that would ultimately claim nearly half of the party's members. The tragedy people remember happened in the snow. The tragedy that caused it happened on the salt. The largest known deposit of a critical modern resource sits directly on top of a documented massacre site. In Humboldt County, Nevada, near the Oregon border, lies Thacker Pass, home to what current estimates describe as the largest confirmed lithium deposit in North America, a resource considered essential to domestic electric vehicle battery production. The northern Paiute and western Shoshone know this same location by another name, tied to a documented event on September 12, 1865, when United States Army soldiers killed dozens of Paiute men, women, and children encamped at the site while most of the tribe's hunters were away. Multiple tribes formally consider the location sacred ground, and legal challenges were filed in federal court in 2021, seeking to halt mining development. Those legal efforts did not succeed, and construction on the site began in 2025. A resource considered vital to the country's future is being extracted from ground that already holds one of its most painful and least acknowledged chapters. One of the most secretive stretches of federal land in the country exists because a dead lake made total secrecy physically possible. Northwest of Las Vegas, inside a section of restricted federal land more than 3 million acres in size, sits a dry lake bed known as Groom Lake, part of the broader Nevada Test and Training Range. The facility built there, publicly acknowledged by federal agencies only as recently as 2013, despite operating since the 1950s, has hosted the development of some of the most advanced reconnaissance and stealth aircraft in American military history. What made this specific location viable for that level of secrecy wasn't chance. It was the same defining feature that shaped the entire Great Basin, a dry, flat, endorheic lakebed sitting in the middle of hundreds of miles of empty federal terrain, land that is nearly impossible to approach undetected, precisely because a body of water disappeared from it long before anyone thought to build there. None of this has ever been treated as one single story until now. A land speed course in Utah, a fault block mountain in Oregon, a ghost town and a shrinking ancient lake in California, a fish species surviving in a single flooded cave, a lithium mine built on a massacre site, and one of the most classified military installations on Earth, both in Nevada. On the surface, these read like a random list of unrelated American oddities scattered across 5 states. And that is exactly how almost every other piece of coverage on this region treats them, as disconnected trivia. But every single one of them sits inside, or directly beside, the exact footprint of 2 ancient inland seas that covered this ground until shockingly recently in geologic terms. The empty land that hides Area 51 is the same empty land that killed the Donner Party's timeline. The salt that set land speed records is the same salt that swallowed a lake down to its bones. This was never a list. It was always one map. 2 vanished seas built this entire hidden landscape, and human beings were alive to watch them disappear. In the eastern half of the Great Basin, Lake Bonneville reached its maximum extent roughly 18 to 19,000 years ago, eventually covering close to 20,000 square miles across what is now western Utah, eastern Nevada, and southern Idaho, with depths exceeding 1,000 feet in places, a body of water comparable in scale to modern Lake Michigan. In the western half of the basin, Lake La Hontan covered more than 8,000 square miles across northwestern Nevada, northeastern California, and southern Oregon, reaching depths of hundreds of feet, larger at its peak than today's Lake Erie. Combined, these 2 vanished seas once held more water than every Great Lake except Superior. Both lakes began their final collapse within the same few thousand years, a stretch of time in which the direct ancestors of today's Shoshone and Paiute peoples were already living along their shores, watching the water recede within living human memory. Every fact in this video, the salt flats, the fault block mountain, the ghost town, the endangered fish, the secret runways, the mining conflict, all of it sits on ground that 2 inland seas carved, filled, and then abandoned, leaving nothing behind but a shoreline etched into stone above a highway that almost nobody looks up long enough to notice. That shoreline is still up there right now, cut into rock above 5 states, in plain sight, on public land, documented in a government survey since 1890. If any single fact in this video changes how you see a drive through Nevada or Utah, tell me which one in the comments, because the discussion under these videos is usually where the best details surface. And if you want to keep tracing the hidden geography hiding across the rest of this country, there's another one waiting for you right now.